Courrières, mean disaster. On March 10th, 1906, nearly 1,800 men and boys descended into the coal mines of the Courrières Company in northern France before dawn, as they did every working morning. Some of them were children, the youngest barely into their teens, sent underground to work the seams alongside their fathers and older brothers. The mine stretched for kilometers beneath the farming communities of Pas de Calais, a labyrinth of tunnels connected by ventilation shafts designed to push fresh air through the workings. At around 6:30 in the morning, something ignited somewhere deep inside. The exact cause was never conclusively established, investigators suspecting either improperly handled explosives or a flame lamp catching a pocket of fire damp, the colorless, odorless methane gas that miners had feared for generations. What followed was not a single explosion, but a series of blasts that propagated through kilometers of tunnels in seconds, using the coal dust hanging in the air as fuel. Each concussion igniting, the next the chain reaction moving faster than any man underground could run. Surface workers reported feeling the ground shake and watching ventilation shaft covers blow off into the sky. Rescue teams went in almost immediately, but the tunnels were filled with afterdamp, the deadly mix of carbon monoxide and nitrogen left by the explosion invisible and lethal, killing rescuers who ventured too deep without protection that did not yet exist in any practical form. Bodies were being recovered for weeks. Then 20 days after the initial explosion, something no one expected happened. 13 miners emerged alive from a sealed section of the mine, having survived for 3 weeks in total darkness on whatever food and water they could find, breathing the stale air trapped with them, hearing the rescuers drilling overhead, and having no way to respond. They were found by accident. When a rescue team broke through a wall, they had sealed from the inside. 1,099 miners in total died in the Courrières disaster, making it the deadliest mining accident in European history, a record that still stands. The mining company was widely accused of prioritizing the rapid recovery of equipment over the rescue of trapped men in the days after the explosion, a charge that triggered strikes across France's coal fields and became a landmark moment in the early French labor movement. The 13 survivors who emerged after 20 days had, by the time they were found, subsisted largely on mine horses kept in the underground stables, eating the animals' feed and killing them one by one to survive. Their emergence shocked the country, not just because they were alive, but because it proved the company's claim that no further survivors could exist underground had been wrong for weeks, while rescue operations had been scaled back. Criminal charges were eventually filed against the mining company's leadership, but no executive ever served prison time for the 1,099 deaths. The inquiry found fault with multiple safety deficiencies, including wholly inadequate ventilation design failure to use safety lamps in gassy conditions and the absence of any meaningful protocol for ignition sources in methane-prone sections. Several of the inquiry's recommendations became the basis for subsequent French mining regulations and contributed to broader European standards on underground ventilation and rescue preparedness. Though enforcement across the industry remained inconsistent for decades, the disaster also produced an unexpected political consequence. It radicalized a generation of French miners and the strikes that followed. Courrières were among the most significant labor actions of the early 20th century, ultimately helping push France towards some of its first formal collective labor agreements. Monongah mining disaster. On December 6, 1907, at around 10:30 in the morning, in the small coal mining town of Monongah, West Virginia, the ground shook. A massive explosion had torn through mines number 6 and 8 of the Fairmont Coal Company, connected underground by a tunnel obliterating the ventilation system, the boiler room, the fan equipment, and the main entrance to mine number 8 in a single catastrophic moment. The mines were filled with workers, most of them recent immigrants, Italians, Russians, Poles, Greeks, men from Austria-Hungary, who had come to Appalachia for the wages the coal industry was offering, and found themselves working in conditions that were, by even the standards of the era, considered extremely hazardous. Many of the men working underground that day had brought family members with them, unofficially boys, who were too young to be on the payroll, but who helped their fathers or brothers with tasks inside the mine. An entirely unrecorded practice that made the true death toll effectively unknowable. The official count was 362, but local historians and Italian government investigators who came to identify their citizens dead subsequently estimated the true number killed was likely between 500 and 600 people. Of the bodies recovered, 171 were identified as Italian immigrants. They left behind 216 widows and 475 children, with another 31 born after the disaster. Only 5 men survived the initial explosion by escaping through a small opening before the mine sealed itself with gas and debris. Rescue teams found the ventilation completely destroyed, making the recovery of victims desperately slow and dangerous. Congress, responding to the scale of Monongah and a series of other disasters in the same year, most of which were separately catastrophic enough to have been headline news in any ordinary year, eventually established the United States Bureau of Mines in 1910, the first federal agency specifically tasked with investigating mine accidents and developing safety standards for the industry. The year 1907 alone saw 18 coal mine disasters in the United States, a rate of failure so extreme that the nation could not continue to absorb it without formal institutional response. Monongah was the disaster that broke the political will to keep looking away. The scale of orphaned and widowed families it produced 216 widows and 475 fatherless children in a single small West Virginia town made the human cost of industrial indifference impossible for Congress to continue treating as a private matter between a mining company and its workforce. Benxihu Colliery disaster. On April 26, 1942, the Benxihu coal mine in Liaoning Province, China, was operating under Japanese wartime occupation, driven at maximum extraction rates to fuel the war effort. Safety was not a priority. The miners who descended that morning were overwhelmingly Chinese laborers, working under conditions that international observers would later describe as forced labor with little meaningful ability to refuse protest or leave the site. Many had been recruited under false pretenses or assigned to the mine directly by occupation authorities. The mine worked them in shifts that left no room for adequate rest, or safety training in tunnels where methane accumulation was an accepted background risk rather than a hazard to be actively managed. At around 1:30 in the afternoon, a gas and coal dust explosion ignited deep inside the mine. The initial blast was severe, but it was what happened next that turned a disaster into a massacre. Japanese mine management, facing a fire deep underground, made the decision to seal the ventilation system and close the mine entrance in an attempt to starve the fire of oxygen. The men still alive inside those who had survived the initial explosion were now trapped in a sealed, burning mine with no fresh air and carbon monoxide slowly filling every tunnel and chamber they were attempting to breathe in. By the time the mine was finally reopened, there was no one left to save. It took 10 days to recover the bodies. The final death toll was 1,549 miners, making Benxihu the deadliest coal mine disaster in all of human history, a record it still holds today. For decades afterward, the full scale of the disaster was almost entirely suppressed, first by the Japanese occupation authorities and then by successive Chinese governments. And it remains far less known internationally than its death toll demands. The mine was never publicly commemorated, the names of most victims were never individually recorded, and their mass grave received no formal memorial for more than 50 years after the explosion. Even today, the Benxihu disaster remains obscure compared to far smaller incidents that occurred in countries where information was not suppressed, a reminder that the historical record of industrial disasters is shaped as much by politics as by body count. The Benxihu's disaster killed 3 times as many people as the Monongah explosion that had shocked America and prompted the creation of a federal safety agency, yet it generated no comparable institutional response, no new regulatory framework, and no international accountability, because the political conditions that would have made accountability possible simply did not exist in wartime occupied China. A sparse memorial was finally established at the site in 1995, more than half a century after the deaths bearing the names of the Chinese laborers who perished, though the names of many could never be confirmed. Upper Big Branch mine disaster. On April 5th, 2010, the day after Easter Sunday, 29 miners were working approximately 1,000 feet underground at the Upper Big Branch coal mine in Raleigh County, West Virginia, operated by Massey Energy, the largest coal producer in central Appalachia. At 3:27 in the afternoon, a spark from a longwall mining machine ignited a pocket of accumulated methane gas. The fireball that resulted immediately encountered a dense cloud of coal dust that had been allowed to settle across the mine's roadways, and the explosion doubled, then doubled again, propagating more than 2 miles through the mine in a chain of blasts. Lasting several minutes, the force of the pressure wave traveling faster than any man working underground could have outrun. 25 men were confirmed dead immediately. 4 more were missing, and rescue teams entered the mine to find them navigating tunnels now full of superheated gas and debris. 4 days later, the 4 missing miners were found dead. They had never made it to either of the mine's 2 pressurized safety chambers. Investigations that followed exposed a picture so damning that federal regulators described Massey's corporate culture as the root cause of the disaster. The mine had accumulated 515 safety violations in the 18 months before the explosion, 2 of which had been cited just the day before. Investigators later discovered an internal phone network that allowed mine supervisors to alert workers of approaching federal inspectors before they arrived underground, giving crews time to temporarily restore ventilation controls, dust suppression systems, and other safety equipment that would be allowed to fall back out of compliance the moment the inspector left. This practice had apparently been operating for years without anyone outside the company detecting it. Its ventilation system was inadequate and poorly maintained. The water systems designed to suppress dust had been allowed to fail. The company had a documented practice of alerting mine supervisors in advance when federal inspectors were due to arrive, giving workers time to temporarily correct violations before they were officially noted, and then resume unsafe operations the moment the inspector left. Massey's CEO, Don Blankenship, was ultimately convicted of a misdemeanor conspiracy to willfully violate federal mine safety regulations and sentenced to a year in federal prison, the first mine executive in American history to face criminal punishment for a mine disaster. Blankenship had run Massey Energy since 1992 and had been one of the most powerful figures in West Virginia politics, a position he used to lobby aggressively against safety regulations he publicly described as unnecessary interference with business. Federal investigators fined Massey $10.8 million, the largest penalty in the agency's history, and described the deaths of 29 men as entirely preventable. One survivor lost his son, his brother, and his nephew in the same explosion. Several men who escaped had brothers and cousins who didn't. The community around Mont Coal, already struggling before the disaster, never fully recovered from the loss of nearly an entire generation of working-age men in a single afternoon. The disaster also ended Massey Energy as a company. It was acquired by a competitor the following year, its assets absorbed, and its name erased, though its records of safety violations lived on in every subsequent congressional hearing about mine regulation in America. Soma mine disaster. On May 13, 2014, at the Enes coal mine in Soma, Western Turkey, a fire broke out underground during the afternoon shift at a moment when 787 workers were beneath the surface. The blaze started near an electrical transformer and spread rapidly through coal material that had been stockpiled too close to the equipment, a basic safety violation documented in inspection reports that had never been acted upon. Warning sensors had been ignored. Safety reports had been falsified. Carbon monoxide detectors were missing from sections of the mine that should have been equipped with them. Gas masks were poorly maintained and inadequate for the conditions underground. Most critically, the mine's ventilation system had been designed with a critical structural flaw, a single main gallery that carried everything together, coal conveyor belts, personnel movement, and ventilation air, all packed into one shared space rather than being routed through separate passages as basic safety standards required. When smoke began filling the tunnels, Hundreds of workers did what they were told to do in an emergency and moved deeper into the mine, following instructions that promised fresh oxygen would be pumped to their location. It was not. The ventilation system, already compromised by the fire's location and the mine's design, could not deliver what those instructions promised. Most of the 301 men who died did so from carbon monoxide poisoning in tunnels they had retreated to because they believed they would be safe there. Rescue operations were hampered for 4 days by ongoing underground fires that repeatedly reignited. Turkey's prime minister visited the site and, in a moment that generated international outrage, reportedly slapped a protesting miner outside the mine during the rescue operation. An official investigation later confirmed that the Soma disaster had been entirely preventable, that its company had been extracting coal at 2.5 times its originally planned production rate since taking over the mine in 2009, and that 432 children had lost their fathers in a mine that its own inspection reports should have shut down long before the fire. A trial eventually resulted in prison sentences for the company's chief executive and 2 mining engineers. A separate trial of 28 public officials, including inspectors and local administrators who had signed off on safety reports despite documented violations, was repeatedly delayed and blocked for years through legal challenges before proceedings finally began in May 2024, a full decade after the disaster. By that point, 432 children had grown up without fathers, and the mining communities around Soma had been living with the visible absence of more than 300 working-age men for an entire decade, while the government officials responsible for oversight waited for their day in court. Erzincan gold mine landslide. On February 13th, 2024, at a gold mine operated by Gold Mining, a company partly owned by a Canadian-American joint venture in the Ilich district of Erzincan province in eastern Turkey. A massive landslide buried the active mining area without warning. 9 workers were trapped beneath an enormous volume of earth and rock that had cascaded down from an unstable waste dump slope that had been accumulating material for years above the open pit operation. The landslide was later estimated to have displaced approximately 10 million cubic meters of material, enough to bury a small city, and it swept directly through the area where workers were conducting morning operations, giving them no time to evacuate. A nearby village was also partially destroyed by the leading edge of the debris flow, forcing hundreds of local residents from their homes. In the immediate aftermath, initial reports suggested the collapse may have been triggered by the failure of a tailings management structure, though investigations into the precise cause continued for months. Rescue operations were launched almost immediately, but the sheer volume of material covering the site, the unstable terrain, and the remote location in eastern Turkey made progress agonizingly slow. As the days turned into weeks and then months, each of the 9 missing workers was confirmed dead in turn, their bodies recovered from different depths within the landslide debris as heavy equipment worked methodically through the material. The last body was not recovered until more than 4 months after the initial collapse. Turkish authorities arrested multiple company executives and site managers in the aftermath, accusing them of ignoring structural warnings about the instability of the waste dump slope in the weeks before the collapse. Investigations found that the slope had been showing signs of movement that experienced engineers should have recognized as a precursor to failure. The Erzincan disaster came less than a decade after Soma and immediately reignited debate in Turkey about whether the country's mining industry, one of the world's most accident-prone per worker, had made any meaningful structural progress on safety in the years between the 2 disasters. Independent engineers hired by prosecutors later produced geotechnical reports indicating the waste dump slope had been visibly deforming in satellite imagery and ground surveys for weeks before the collapse movement that should have triggered mandatory evacuation of the pit area under Turkish mining law. The fact that workers were present in the zone when it finally gave way suggested either those reports had not reached mine management or that they had, and production was not halted anyway. Both possibilities pointed to the same failure mode. The warning existed and the mine kept running. Looking across all 6 of these disasters spanning more than a century, and 5 countries, 3 elements recur with a consistency that is impossible to ignore. Someone in a position of authority knew something was wrong before the accident. The warning was either dismissed, falsified, or simply never passed on to anyone who could act on it. And the people with the least power, the miners who went underground because there was no other work, or because the alternative was refusing and losing the job entirely paid with their lives for decisions made by people who never entered the mine at all. The Soma company's sensors were disabled. Massey's safety violations were cleaned up the morning before inspectors arrived and resumed the afternoon they left. The San Jose mine's safety ladder was broken for months before anyone fell. The Benxihu mine's managers sealed the exits not to save the men inside, but to protect the equipment. From Courrières in 1906 to Erzincan in 2024. That sequence has repeated across more than a century, changing its language and its geography, but never its essential structure. Mining remains one of the most dangerous occupations on Earth, not because the hazards are unknown, but because the economic pressure to keep going has again and again proven stronger than the institutional will to stop. The technology to detect methane measure, slope stability, monitor dust accumulation, and test ventilation has existed in one form or another since long before most of these disasters. What was missing was never the knowledge of what to look for. It was the decision each time to actually look. If you enjoyed this video, subscribe for similar ones, and feel free to drop suggestions for the next video in the comments below.